Hello everyone, Salam, Namaste, Adab, and welcome to today's event. Today we are going to hear three activists from India, especially Mr. Biraj Patnaik, who was the South Asia Director of Amnesty International and now is Executive Director of National Foundation for India. The theme is Testing Times, the Challenges for Civil Society in India. This theme and the speaker will be introduced by Ms. Ingrid Srinath, who is the founder director of Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy at Ashoka University. She is a human rights activist, social justice and civil society advocate. And the concluding remarks will be given by Mr. Sanjay Agrawal, who is a professional accountant and expert on FCRA and NPO taxation, served on Asia Pacific Philanthropy Consortium and Institute of Chartered Accountant of India, including also in the Planning Commission. So welcome you all, and I'll now invite Ms. Ingrid Srinath to introduce the topic and the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Razi. And hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. I'm not going to even try to introduce Biraj. He scarcely needs an introduction. You've already been told that he's been Director South Asia for Amnesty International and currently is Executive Director at the National Foundation for India, which plays a kind of a linchpin role in building solidarity across civil society, amplifying the less heard voices of Indian society, advocating for civil society, and a list too long for me to go into today. What I thought I could do, in fact, was before Biraj paints for us the picture of the challenges confronting civil society today in India, it might be useful for me to provide some context on the state of the funding for civil society in India, particularly, of course, the philanthropic landscape. Well before the recent changes to the laws governing civil society funding, be that FCRA or the Companies Act on corporate social responsibility or the income tax laws, civil society in India already faced a very daunting minefield of regulations that make it near impossible for NGOs to ever achieve any degree of independence or sustainability. It is, for example, impossible to build up reserves. It's impossible to generate independent revenue streams, even to fully recover administrative expenses without losing your tax-exempt status or worse. This, of course, results in a perpetual hand-to-mouth subsistence existence, leaving NGOs entirely unable to make any kind of long-term plans or to make any investments in their own capacities. This, of course, means that they're constantly subject to donor whims. Since the early 1990s, when we had this vast transfer of wealth to private hands by the processes of economic liberalization, Indian philanthropy has come to be dominated by big business. These so-called new philanthropists bring to their philanthropy the sort of techno-managerial approach that served them well in their business avatars. This is an approach that is averse to rights-based community-driven changes. It sees capacity, it sees campaigning and policy advocacy as too political, and it prefers very narrowly defined, easy to measure, service delivery kind of programs that focus on filling the gaps in public spending rather than supporting those that question why those gaps exist in the first place. Most recently, a couple of weeks ago, the stock market regulator, SEBI, announced the launch of a social stock exchange, which I expect will further exacerbate the bias towards programs that appeal to this return on investment kind of mindset and closely align with government priorities, as well as, are amenable to this sort of short-term impact measurement. So when you add that dominance by business or philanthropy, and you look at the way international funding and government funding of civil society organizations plateauing or tapering off, what we have now is a civil society that is almost entirely dependent on the corporate sector for its funding, be this in the form of the mandatory CSR provision or in the form of funding from high net worth families. What this does is virtually silence any potential criticism of business by at least the mainstream civil society organizations, and it severely curtails any likelihood of business being called to account for either environmental or human rights violations or both. But even more perniciously, what it's doing is leading to an increasingly corporate mindset among NGOs, as both board positions and senior leadership roles get occupied by people crossing over from the corporate to the social sector, because they are perceived to have the ability to navigate this funding landscape that is dominated by big business. What that does, this dominance of NGO governance and leadership structures in turn, is it leads to sort of self-censorship by NGOs and the prioritization of market-friendly program strategies at the cost of causes that are less popular with corporate funders. If you layer onto this the fact that mainstream media is also almost fully controlled by big business, which constrains civil society's capacity for policy advocacy and its access to public support. Then you add the fact that private funders of academic institutions are facing increasingly overt pressure to ensure that faculty and students toe the party line. And then you look at the fact that there is ongoing pressure on online platforms to censor inconvenient voices, as well as provide access to user data. That then gives you a sense of the siege under which civil society finds itself. Finally, you have to add on the introduction of electoral bonds, which make political party funding entirely opaque. And then you combine that with plain old-fashioned crony capitalism, and you have a complete encirclement of civil society by India's most wealthy and the political forces that they align with. This makes it virtually impossible to mount any kind of serious challenge to the rising tide of inequality, or to advocate for human rights or the environment, or even just to support communities who have been systematically excluded from development, or those that are being targeted by majoritarian forces. So that's the landscape, if you will, in which civil society in India finds itself. I'm going to hand you over now to Biraj to take you through the details.
Thanks very much, Ingrid. I'm Biraj, and I head the National Foundation for India, but I'm speaking here in my personal capacity. So firstly, thanks to the organizers and Razi Sir for having invited me for this. It's always a pleasure to address a wider group of people who have a stake in India and are deeply worried about what they see, what they read, and provide some kind of perspective to what's happening here. I think the situation itself doesn't merit much discussion, because all of you are aware, perhaps in many ways, as people who are informed of this, because there's a barrage of negativity and negative news that keeps coming out. Every day brings out a new challenge, a new law, a new assault on freedoms or constitutional morality from India. So we are familiar with that. So I just want to make it very specifically focused on what civil society in India, and civil society, of course, as we know, is very broadly everything outside the state and the market, though often we refer to civil society as NGOs. So let's say institutional civil society or NGOs what are the kind of regulatory and other challenges that we face, and what does the road ahead look for us? Over the past 8 years now, we have sufficient experience of dealing with a very centralized model of power on and a complete uh, sort of diminishing of the rule of law. So I want to highlight how this impacts, say, non-governmental organizations in India. Now, Ingrid, thanks for mentioning the regulatory the pressures that organizations are facing. India has, even at the best of times, had a very bad, unsupportive regulatory environment for non-governmental organizations, be it the tax laws, be it the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, or the slew of legislations that NGOs or compliances that NGOs have to do, even at the best of times. So, for instance, most of the laws that are now being used on an industrial scale by the current government, by the BJP government, are laws which were introduced by Congress governments in the past and have been used by Congress governments in the past. What you're seeing now is a use at a scale which is unprecedented. I mean, just the sheer numbers are staggering. And secondly, the manner in which individuals, organizations are being targeted, which is again on a very large scale. So I just want to focus a bit on that. Now, firstly, if you look at the laws that are most egregious violations that we see today, or the most egregious overuse of laws by the state, you can broadly classify them in three baskets. There's, of course, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which governs what money comes into India, which is spent for charitable purposes. This was a law introduced in the 1970s, 1976, which has been subsequently amended, the latest one being by the BJP government in 2020. And before that, of course, in a few years ago when the UPA was in power. The second, and that's more or less overarching law that governs foreign funding in India. The second law is the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, which was never really relevant for non-governmental organizations. It was mostly for terror financing, drugs, human trafficking, and so on, but is increasingly being used now against not just organizations, but individuals whom one could say belong to the larger civic space in India. And third would be, of course, the UAPA, which, as you know, is the primary anti-terror law in the country. And that is against the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is now increasingly being used against not just NGOs, but really a very wide range of people, including politicians, fact checkers, to comedians, to non-governmental organizations, academics, journalists. You have a very, very wide swathe of laws now which covers civil society action. So I just want to first take you very briefly through what are the changes and what are the implications of these changes. So if you start with the Foreign Currency Regulation Act, in 2020, there were specific amendments that were made, which are now impacting us. And they will impact, and the use of FCRA, of course, has a great impact on the diaspora community. And I'm hoping that Sanjay will, of course, speak to us a bit about that, on how the diaspora can be more careful to ensure that people that they support their causes for do not become an excuse for putting more pressure on the causes that are being supported. Because we've seen a number of instances where the diaspora community's actions in making donations for a good cause have ended up landing the people they made donations to in fairly serious trouble. So Sanjay will, of course, cover that ground for us. But primarily in 2020, there were there were 5 key points in the amendments that were made. One, that every organization which receives any kind of support from outside needs to be registered, needs to have a bank account in Delhi with one branch of State Bank of India at Parliament Street, which theoretically is fine, but in real terms has posed great difficulty, especially for organizations which work in remote parts of the country. So somebody working in Tuensang district of Nagaland has to open a bank account in Delhi, physically presenting the paper getting the paperwork processed. And there was a very short window for getting this done. Nonetheless, large number of organizations have done that now. The second, and I think one of the most impactful provisions in the negative sense, was the banning of re-granting of money. So suppose you wanted to donate to a good cause in India, as a diaspora community, you had two choices. One, you could physically come here and find that organization in Jharkhand or Bihar or in Tamil Nadu or wherever and give them money, or you could give it to an organization that would then pass it forward. And that was inconvenient, but fine, because both organizations needed to be registered under FCRA, which brought its own set of complications. And if anything, this law needed to be liberalized. Today, re-granting is not possible. So if you gave it to an organization in India, they cannot pass it on to any person, anybody else, but they have to necessarily spend it themselves in their book of accounts. What the direct implication of that is that you cannot reach out, the outreach of smaller organizations or access of smaller organizations to donors has significantly reduced. It has also meant that people who were fundamentally re-granting agencies would identify the best people on the ground and support them are no longer able to do so. So most of the larger aggregators are impacted by this, especially those who were dependent on, whose business model was essentially fundamentally re-granting, because that is a service that's valuable, it's needed. You needed somebody to curate programs and get them supported. That can no longer happen. The most draconian part of the amendment was the ability of the state now to reappropriate your assets if you are a FCRA organization that loses its FCRA. So if you had an FCRA, say dating back to the 70s or 80s, and today you reapplied for your FCRA and you are not able to get your FCRA, the law now states that this government will reappropriate everything that you have. So if you have an office which is built with FCRA funds, it will be taken over by government. If you have money in your bank account which is built with FCRA funds, it will be taken over by government. It's unprecedented reappropriation of private assets created out of foreign money in India by the state. And I think a large number of religious organizations, particularly those from minority communities, churches and trusts and so on belonging to minorities, which have used this route to build facilities, educational, health facilities, so on, would get deeply impacted by this, because they are now have to be extra careful to ensure that they don't lose their FCRA, because every school, college, university, whatever they've built, health facility with FCRA funds will revert back to the government in case the FCRA goes. And lastly, what seems like a very harmless amendment but has great grave impacts is the reduction of administrative costs from 50% to 20%. Now, ideally, that shouldn't be a big problem. 20% should be enough to cover administrative expenses. But in reality, because the manner in which administrative expenses are so loosely defined by the law, it affects advocacy units, it affects anyone doing research, anyone doing advocacy very badly, any think tank, because all their expenses technically government could turn around any day and say that these were administrative expenses. If it is not a direct field survey, there is nothing in the law which says that a researcher's salary or somebody leading a research program can be put into program expenses and so on. So now this is one part of the story. The other part of the story is that the renewal process has been used to either deny or keep a large number of organizations hanging by putting them under process. This is a process that started in May last year, and it was supposed to be concluded within 90 days. What we see now is that it's 2022 August, and a tiny fraction of the organizations who applied for the FCRA have actually got it. And most organizations have not got it. So we don't have accurate data from the government, but our estimate, and Sanjay ji is someone who works on this continuously, so he'll correct me if I'm wrong, is roughly less than a third of the organizations who have got an FCRA have been renewed, less than a third. And of the rest, the 2/3, a vast majority are under process. And therefore, this does not allow organization to have any kind of business continuity from May last year. You cannot plan for your future. You cannot recruit staff. You cannot start new programs because you're not sure whether you'll be able to continue the program in case you do not get your FCRA license renewed. So the atmosphere, as you can understand, therefore, within institutional civil society is quite chilling. You had audits of more than 300 organizations across the country conducted by the Ministry of Home Affairs directly, where auditors stay anywhere between 7 to 10 days in the organization and look at your accounts. And many of these, and the ministry doesn't revert back to you on audit reports. They will act on the audit reports, but you will not have a chance to review that report. So the principles of natural justice, in a sense, don't apply, and that creates an additional layer of great uncertainty. Having said this, I would say that the impact of this is not across the board, to be fair. One, if you're a certain kind of organization, which means that if you're an organization that is aligned to the objectives of the government or to the larger ideological project that India is now headed towards, which is the Hindu Rashtra, then you have nothing to worry, because then you are covered. Somebody's got your back. If you're an organization that's primarily into service delivery and has trustees who are either part of the ideological project or largely not seen as controversial by any way by the government, then you're largely protected. Because please remember that every single board member today of any organization in India which is applied for an FCRA is subject to a detailed scrutiny by the Intelligence Bureau, including visits by the Intelligence Bureau to every single person who is a trustee in an organization. So if you get a negative report from the IB, either based on their field visits, or even if you get a report saying, I went to this trustee's house, and we have seen cases where it's happened, and she was not present at home, and therefore, we conclude that we conclude this in our report that we cannot say for certainty if that person stays in the address that is given. Organizations have had their FCRA not renewed. So we have a number of cases that we've looked at now where just the fact that the trustees were not available at the site when the IB came, without, of course, prior intimation, has been a reason for non-renewal. The third kind of organizations are those who are explicitly in a charitable purpose. So, and who are not either opposed to the government or seen as opposed to the government, but in a very, very service delivery mode, as I had said earlier, they are likely to have their FCRAs renewed. Organizations working on disaster relief or humanitarian causes, for instance, are seen as organizations that would get it. Therefore, the targeting very specifically is around organizations who do advocacy. Now, a good example is Oxfam. Oxfam does a lot of service delivery. It does a lot of human rights, humanitarian work in cases of emergencies and disasters. It also does a lot of advocacy. It brings out an annual inequality report. It stands up for people on the margins. It does not hesitate to use its members and its constituents abroad to raise issues of public importance in India in global forums. And therefore, Oxfam's FCRA was not renewed. And it was, the reason assigned was that it is not in public interest for Oxfam's FCRA to be renewed in India. Now that becomes a kind of very egregious action. And in Oxfam's case, of course, because it's a global organization, it's had a lot of people advocating and speaking up for it at the highest levels, both from the US, Europe, UK, other parts of the world. And yet, Oxfam India is virtually now on life support in India because they would not be able to continue if they do not get their FCRA license renewed sooner than later. We also had the instance of Missionaries of Charity, whose FCRA was knocked off on Christmas Day. They got the news on on Christmas Day, organization headed by Mother Teresa, that their FCR is not being renewed, which would have threatened the entire work that they do. And remember, missionaries of charities is, I mean, it is what it is. It is what the name suggests. They're neither an advocacy organization nor a think tank, nor are they people who would be in global forums speaking about issues which impact Indians. They're just running palliative care homes, orphanages, and so on and so forth. And yet they were selected for, had the distinction of being selected to have their FCRA not renewed. But fortunately, wider sense prevailed when there was a global outrage, and it was restored shortly thereafter. The second set of laws that I want to speak about, because they are now being increasingly used to target NGOs, is the money laundering laws or economic offences laws, which is quite unprecedented. So the Prevention of Money Laundering Act we now have a number of cases in India where the PMLA has been used against organizations, where there is any violation or sense of any violation, even though the offences committed may not be strictly in the purview of the list of offences which can be persecuted under PMLA, the Schedule A offences. So two examples that I want to cite here. One is, of course, Amnesty, where we've seen where the allegation against Amnesty is that they got foreign funds into India to do charity work, whereas they should have brought the money in to do business. So they got the money, not charity, human rights work, that they got money into India to do human rights work rather than use it for a business, because they brought the money in through the FDI route as a private limited company. And the second set of PMLA allegations now that we're seeing, the more prominent cases are, one is Mr. Harsh Mandar, who's currently a Robert Bosch Fellow and who's also a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, doesn't need an introduction to this audience. But his organization, the Center for Equity Studies, has been specifically targeted under the PMLA on allegations of fraud in running children's homes, based on a first information report by Delhi police, which was provoked by a very ideologically motivated attack from the National Commission for Protection for Child Rights, which is, and some of their actions are very well documented in the media now. And now that organization is being targeted under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, even though the predicate offense itself, the first information report by the police, doesn't seem to suggest any fraud. So just to make a point, that the reason why the PMLA is being invoked is basically because the Prevention of Money Laundering Act gives very wide sweeping powers to the Enforcement Directorate. The powers to freeze your account, the powers to arrest without good reason, and to keep you in detention. And if you look at the number of raids conducted by PMLA, particularly on political parties, amongst others, there has been a 20-30-fold increase. You've had close to 3,000 raids since 2014, as compared to a lower 100 number in the 10 years preceding that. So basically, you are using an agency and a law against people where the law strictly shouldn't be applied, because you have the ability to strike fear, to put people behind bars long periods of time without recourse to the normal systems of justice that you would have under any other law. The ability to freeze assets, take over assets, freeze bank accounts, and the chilling impact that it has. So that's the second. And third, of course, is the anti-terror laws that we've now seen being used against academics, journalists, all kinds of people, reporters who've gone to do reporting in an area, to report a rape case. Today find themselves behind bars and have a law like UAPA invoked against them. So the entire purpose, therefore, now of regulation is retribution. It's not regulation anymore, it is retribution. The messaging is quite clear, the impact that it is having is quite clear, and it is the desired impact as far as the state is concerned, which is to bring to a standstill any action by civil society organizations that have a potential to confront, challenge, criticize, or point out anything that is against the current ideological project of the government. And it could be something as as innocuous as bringing out data, because there is a historical animosity to data that we have with the people in power currently, in power today. Anyone who just brings out data then becomes suspect, is labeled. And what you see now is it's not just the attack from the state, but a range of non-state actors which have come up across India, particularly on social media, where the trolling of organizations, institutions, individuals is at a level which was, again, not been seen, or is very rare if you look at it in terms of the overall perspective over the last 10-15 years. But I don't want to go into that, because of course there is a huge it's a topic in itself, the social media trolling that's happening today. It's very gendered. Women are being targeted, minorities are being targeted, and it's very, very widespread. But that's not something I want to dwell on. But just say that often these non-state actors are the reason why state action is provoked against individuals and institutions, and which is why we should be worried about this latest trend. And now, what therefore is the way forward for civic space? Yes, there's been a chilling effect. Yes, but are there any positives at all? And how do we really move forward in an atmosphere that we have today? Because I think increasingly we also need to talk about the positives and talk about how do we move forward from here. Because the situation sometimes appears so grim that we are caught up in the narrative that has been set for us. And the narrative that has been set for us in the larger ideological project of the Hindu Rashtra that's unfolding, you are never able to do anything, either A, because you're paralyzed, and that's happened with institutional civil society a lot. The people are basically self-censoring for good reason, because they don't want to draw attention to themselves. They don't want to address a webinar which would get them into trouble if it's put into the public domain, because the entire institutional survival could be impacted because of this. They don't want to draw any negative news because it's going to scare away funders, as Ingrid said. They're going to be blacklisted by philanthropists if they are seen to have attracted or made any controversial statements, either against the government, or even, as I said, something innocuous is putting out data that doesn't speak highly of our efforts, like, say, the successful or the claims about successfully managing COVID, which is a very good example. So therefore, what's the way forward? I think one thing that I'm increasingly seeing is that there is a recognition, even amongst those who are silent, that it cannot be business as usual. I do see coalitions being formed, associations being formed, people doing what they are meant to be doing, but shifting their ways of doing it so as not to draw attention to themselves. But continuing, there is a great deal of resilience that I find, especially in the civil liberties sector, where people are continuing with their work at great risk to themselves, but also doing it smartly, ensuring that they don't run afoul of the law, and ensuring that they reach the people who are impacted the most. Second, I do see a lot of a consensus that what is at stake is not just survival of organizations or institutions, but what is at stake is the issue of constitutional morality in India. And it's an existential threat, not just to organizations, but all of us who have been proud of being Indians, or being part of the narrative of India and the constitutional narrative of India, which is severely dented, not just here, but even the image of India abroad. So I see a lot of consolidation that is happening today, which one had not seen. The third positive is that with any centralized, governments come and governments go. No one rules forever. People will bring about a change when they feel that they need to do it, and when they realize that the project that they are on is not going to lead them to the future that they want, but can only lead them towards a civil war rather than something positive which will improve their life situation. And therefore, over-centralization, the demerits of it are becoming increasingly clear, because when you over-centralize, the first thing you do is consolidation or concentration of power ensures that you lose any self-correcting mechanism. You lose the ability to be reflective of any criticism, because everyone who could remotely criticize you is out of the window. Now, a very good example I'll give you of a real-time example, if you may, is the centralization that's happened under the FCRA, because you've given power to so few people uh, in one ministry, which is the Ministry of Home Affairs, with absolutely no public consultation on the processes that need to be followed to get your FCRA renewed. You've had a huge corruption scandal, which has led them to make sweeping changes. People have been arrested, FIR has been filed, there's a CBI case ongoing. So that's a good example of how centralization of power will lead to these things, which eventually, one at a time would lead to perhaps something much larger at a societal level. The fourth positive thing I see is that organizations across the board, small and big, even in rural areas, are now also beginning to understand that if we have to protect the constitutional project, we need to work on narratives. And they do believe that these narratives are really key, that you can't have a situation where the narrative is set by somebody else and you are just responding to the narrative. And this narrative is not just about the larger issues that confront Indian society, but the day-to-day narrative about what civil society represents. Today, the narrative has been set by the government that civil society is either seen as against national interest, which is anti-national, or anti-Hindu, to be more specific, or corrupt, inefficient, people who just are taking public money but not using it properly. Unless, of course, there's civil society that is backing the government, in which case they're clean. But what that has done is essentially create within the middle classes or within a large swathe of Indian society a very negative narrative. So unless you're a beneficiary, a direct beneficiary, or a rights holder who's impacted by a civil society organization's work, you would tend to believe what the government says about them or what the non-state actors in the right say about them. And I think changing that is important. And I think a lot of organizations are now changing that. They are coming together to work on narratives. I was recently in Bombay, and before that in Chhattisgarh, before that in Bhopal, just in this month. And I can see smaller collectives coming together to change the narrative, not just on the larger issues which confront us, which people have been trying to do, but on the day-to-day functioning of civil society and what it represents. And the last positive thing I would say is that civil society is becoming far more savvy on social media, and perhaps we're 10 years too late, but at least it's getting there. People are using social media in creative ways to amplify it, and often not doing it directly, which is amplifying dissent, because that would come with serious consequences, but doing it in a way where they're getting their message through without giving cause for offense to governments, which would be sustained or held up in a court of law. So doing it well, doing it smartly, focusing on issues that matter, on Adivasis, Dalits, Muslims, minorities, and so on, and creating a constituency on social media within these communities through district level YouTubers, through smaller characters. Smaller district, sub-district, block level people who are very local influences with say 1,000, 2,000 followers, but consolidating them, reaching out to them, giving them material, bringing them into their sphere of influence, starting a public dialogue of sorts, both physical and on social media, that one hadn't seen before. So I'm still very hopeful that given this, I mean, the wheel certainly has to turn. And if we were to focus on these, if we were to get a little more strategic in the ways we operate, and not be strategic by giving up the work that we're doing and falling in line, but being strategic in continuing to do the work that we are doing, refusing to fall in line, but still staying the course. I think I do see a lot of hope that we can challenge not just the narrative, but also change the situation on the ground. And I would end by saying that nothing is given. The helplessness and despair that most people feel, particularly those who watch what is unfolding from a distance in India, need not be what they should feel. We should come back together and do what we can from where we are located to ensure that we move forward, because what is at stake is, as I said, the continuing constitutional morality and the idea of India as have we have believed in since 1947. And I think every community has a role to play. The Indian diaspora in many parts of the world is now very actively involved in advocacy, in changing the mindsets of governments, because diplomacy today is primarily driven by trade and national interests of respective governments. And the fact that you have the huge China factor in our neighborhood, where I mean, if you take the US, for instance, the Biden administration has taken a much harder line on China than even Trump did. And what that means, therefore, is that there becomes an air of indispensability of India in the larger global narrative, which means that geostrategically, India's importance is now pegged to the desire of the West to cut China down to size, particularly post-COVID. And you cannot have a kind of simultaneous war of attrition between two of the largest countries in the world who are neighbors. And therefore, India is viewed from the prism of China often, and the self-interest of countries in the West, including the US, the UK, Europe, North America, in terms of the engagement with the Indian state and how hard they can push back on human rights violations. But therefore, I would think that the role of the diaspora is cut out. The role of the diaspora is also to not just influence governments, but also influence their own kind, because there are a large number of diaspora Indians who can be guided to just see objectively what is happening in the country today. Because there are a large number, I mean, let's be honest about this, that the right-wing causes in India have managed to draw a huge support for various historical and psychological reasons from Indians abroad. And the only example where I can think of where the diaspora actually came together for a progressive cause in recent memory is the farmers' protest, where a large number of people across the world who were of Indian origin came together to support the farmers' movement. I have not seen that really at that scale ever. So I think your role is pretty much cut out. And the message that we should carry is not just one of despair and hopelessness, but also of converging our positive energies together to ensure that we make the change that we want to see, and to be that change is that we want to see, and reclaim the ideas that we think we have lost over the decade, sort of close to a decade of lost opportunity for a more vibrant, democratic India that we had very much hoped for. So I'll end here so that we have much more time for discussion and answering questions. I'll hand the floor over to Sanjay ji now, because Sanjay can bring us back to earth with some more grounded observations pertaining to particularly how communities can be, diaspora communities need to be more watchful, of course, while supporting causes in India to ensure that the recipients don't end up in the legal troubles that we have seen happening in the recent past. So over to you, Sanjay ji, is somebody who's done for the last three decades and more, been studying, working with organizations on regulatory issues, and guiding institutions to stay out of trouble, while ensuring that financial probity and compliance is at the heart of civic work. So over to you, Sanjay ji, to tell us more about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Biraj. And I will not take much of your time. I hope I am audible.
Yes, you did.
Yes. Okay. So let me start off. This FCRA, unfortunately, is a very, very complex piece of architecture, and it's a very small act, but very complex, and also a source of my livelihood. So I will not berate it too much. Nevertheless, so the key issue that I thought I will briefly touch upon is this concept of foreign source, and that is where many of you are sort of personally and critically affected. And so foreign source under FCRA is where sort of brunt of the anger of FCRA is focused. And that essentially consists of three kinds of people. One is, businesses or corporate entities formed abroad or under foreign control. Second is donor agencies. And third is individuals, diaspora like yourself. And within those individuals, we have essentially three categories. One is, who are foreign citizens in the sense that they are not, they were never Indians. And the second is, PIOs, persons of Indian origin, people who are, who were at some point of time held an Indian passport, or they are married to an Indian or something like that. And those people are foreign source, whether they are residing in India or abroad. And the third, of course, is the category which people talk about, overseas citizen of India, which is really not a separate category. It's only a kind of a tag. So the main category that we are talking about in the diaspora is persons of Indian origin and persons who are living abroad but are still holding their Indian passport. Now, when persons of Indian origin like yourself, for example, some of you want to give money in India to a cause, then I would like to explain to you how you can get trapped. Now, before I do that, let me tell you that the jurisdiction of FCRA extends to Indian citizens living abroad as well as to foreigners living within India. So in that sense, when a person of Indian origin is giving money to an individual, then that they can do for personal use. If it is being given, there is no restriction. It can even be given. It can even be given to, for example, if you want to support someone for COVID relief or for building a house, etc. So you give to that individual, that's perfectly fine. But if you were giving a gift to a relative, even if that relative happens to be your spouse who is an Indian citizen, then the moment that gift exceeds 1 million rupees, whether it's an emerald bracelet or something like that, or it's money, the recipient will have to report it to the Ministry of Home Affairs. So the Ministry of Home Affairs will know exactly how much love and affection this couple are having between them. The third category, and which is the dangerous category, which is why I have highlighted red, is for the benefit of others. Now, the moment you give one of your friends or neighbors any money for helping others, for let's say that others, in the colony or in the place where you lived, in the village or the city that you live, then that person needs to have an FCRA registration or clearance before you can give money. So that is the key that you have to keep in mind, and that is where, for example, I'm not sure whether you heard recently there was a case where an Indian journalist started raising money on an online portal, and this person has faced an FIR and is now being investigated for a possible violation of FCRA. And that brings me to the second question, that whenever you are giving money, a PIO, a person of Indian origin, is giving money to an Indian portal or a crowdfunding portal, then also they have to keep this in mind that they will see, and they can give only to a foreign FCRA registered organization. The third category is sometimes persons of Indian origin, they get together and they form something called Friends of, let's say, Pratham or any other NGO, for example, and then they start collecting money, and that money they route and they provide to their cause in India. Now that again is an FCRA technicality, that money, even if that person was an Indian, that money would still require FCRA registration. So just to make this comparison clear, so we were looking just now at person of Indian origin. Now let's look at a slightly different picture in the case where the person is actually an Indian citizen. He or she continues to hold their Indian passport and is living abroad. That person, even if that person is contributing in dollars or in pounds, they can give money to an individual for personal use, for gift to their relative, or for benefit of others without any restriction. I'm talking, of course, about an individual in India. They can also contribute money on Indian portals or crowdfunding portals to entities which don't have FCRA registration. They can, however, if they were to give money through friends of the same association which I talked about, that very money which was Indian earlier on will become non-Indian, because this friends of such and such entity is actually formed abroad or operating abroad. And same applies to if you give the money through a let's say a Give to Asia portal, or Give Directly kind of a portal, which is a foreign portal based abroad, then your money will convert into a foreign contribution because it passes through this person. So these are some of the things that I thought that it would be useful for you to keep in mind. FCRA is unfortunately an extremely complex and complicated matter. I would not like to spoil your evening, your evening or your day with going into too much detail, but I am happy to take any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, all speakers. It was wonderful and very informative. And I'll, before we go into question and answer session, let us have two posters or two announcements for future coming and present week. Haris, can you show the posters, please? Haris? Rafat? Hello? What?
Yeah, where is Haris? I don't have them. I didn't see your email. But did you send to me also?
Yes, yes.
Hello.
Haris,
Abba.
why? Just show the poster, please.
Okay.
Can you change the poster to
Next one.
coming one? Okay, leave that poster. Can you show the third poster that I just sent you? Or you are unable to show it?
Is this the one?
Yes. This is the upcoming poster for the next week. And so everybody should just remember this. We are going to talk on Can Indian Muslim Bulldoze the Politics of Prejudice? Professor Akhtarul Wasif from Jamia and Professor Muqtadar Khan from University of Delaware are going to talk. Is there a third poster? Another poster that I gave it to you?
No, but this was the final one.
No, there was a third
Just
one
right
that
now.
you got it, but you are unable to get it. Okay, take it out, please.
Okay.